Welcome to Let's Talk Death, conversations to inform and inspire. Let's Talk Death is a series of conversations with some amazing people from various fields. Our goal through these conversations is to normalize, educate, and demystify the taboo around death, dying, and the journey of grief. Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Paul Perry. Paul is an author and documentary filmmaker. He has co-written several New York Times bestsellers, including The Light Beyond and Evidence of the Afterlife. He was knighted in Portugal for his film and book about Salvador Dalí and the secret painting that changed his life. His latest books, Glimpses of Eternity, Sharing a Loved One's Passage from This Life to the Next, and Paranormal, My Life in Pursuit of the Afterlife, are the fourth and fifth books he has co-written with Dr. Raymond Moody, the founder of Near-Death Studies. Paul is a graduate of Arizona State University and Antioch University. Paul, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
So, Paul, before we speak about your work, I'd like to know, our audience likes to connect. Was there a personal experience that led your interest into the afterlife?
Well, I had no personal experience at that point. Those came later. But my experience getting into this whole field of study was I was editing a magazine called American Health Magazine. This was in the late 80s, most successful magazine of the 80s. And I was contacted by my agent, Nat Sobel, and he's also Raymond's agent. And he said, would you like to help Raymond Moody write a book? It would be a book about the 10 or 15 years since he wrote Life After Life and the research that had been done. And I said, I have no idea who Raymond Moody is. And Nat said, well, you know, he's the guy who named and defined the near-death experience. I said, you know, I don't even know what that is. And he says, what's wrong with you, man? Don't you watch Oprah? Because Raymond was on Oprah frequently. And so I decided I needed to learn something that I didn't know anything about. And I went to Georgia to work with Raymond on what was entitled The Light Beyond, which was the first book we did. And that was a book that looked at, I think it was at that time about 15 years of research that had been done about near-death experiences. And in the course of doing that book, I saw a really significant gap in the research. And that was children. There was no research being done on the effects of a near-death experience on children and on the long-term effects of near-death experiences. So I said to Raymond, you know, we're really missing something in this book. We have nothing about children. And Raymond said, oh, there's a guy in Seattle who's working on that, working on research. His name is Melvin Morse. So I went to Seattle, met with Melvin, and we ended up working on a book and writing a book called Closer to the Light, which was strictly a book on children and near-death experiences. And I wrote the proposal for the book, and we sent it out to, I think, 21 publishers. 19 of them rejected it. And I had all these rejection letters, and they were full of things like people don't care this much about their children. Children don't remember things. Like a near-death experience. This might be a good magazine article. I got rejected once by somebody because I had a typo on page 2 of my proposal. So meanwhile, it got bought by Diane Reverend, the editor-in-chief at at Random House. And I'm sitting there reading these rejection letters, and she says, if you handle this right, it's going to be huge. And I said, I'm glad she's not looking at what I'm looking at now. And it ended up being huge. We ended up on Oprah with the book. So there's everyone's dream. And from that point on, I've continued to find gaps in other books and fill in the gaps in research and in near-death studies. So I've done a total of 15 books on near-death experiences. 6 have been New York Times bestsellers.
And going from not knowing anything about near-death experiences, not being part or a piece to that, but
Right.
really finding somewhere there. Is there anything that surprised you when you started to move into this work, or what was that like for you to?
Well, that's what I liked about it, is it all surprised me. It all surprised me. I mean, I think everyone's heard things like near-death experiences, and when I started working on it, I realized I had to. People would have nearly drowned in pools and things like that. I live in Arizona. Everyone has a pool, and but everything surprised. I knew nothing about a life review. I knew very little about out-of-body experiences other than what I would see on cartoons or movies. And so it was great. It was all a fresh field for me, and I love that. Because it gave me a chance to just totally knew something. I realized I had a vacuum in my own life, and this was filling that vacuum.
So I'm curious, can you recognize a defining point? Was there a defining point where there was skepticism in others, in the experiences that others were sharing, to an epiphany that this is real, this really happens?
Yeah. Well, I'm a journalist primarily and a writer, and I'm a skeptic, because everything is BS to a journalist. So until they prove it, or at least get it past deadline. And so I finally came into some case studies, though, that I just found wow, these are amazing. I mean, one was a woman named Vi Horton, who I met in the South at Raymond's house, and she had had a gallbladder surgery. And back in the day, gallbladder surgeries were far more dangerous, I guess you would say, than they are now. And she coded in the middle of a gallbladder surgery, and she had a cardiac arrest. And she had a cardiac arrest, and she had an out-of-body experience. And her out-of-body experience involved leaving the surgery, going down the hall, going out into the waiting room, seeing her children. She went over to her brother-in-law, who was on the phone to a friend. Her brother-in-law was ready to go play golf, and he was on the phone to a friend saying, "I can't meet with you today. Fran's about to kick the bucket, so I've got to stick around here." And he saw that her daughters were dressed in mismatched plaids. And so she saw all this, and she witnessed it. And to me, that was a sign that consciousness had actually left her body. And that's how the doctors who had treated her felt, and the nurses and everyone else who was around. They're all saying, "Wow, this is really something." And that is the first one that I really, really connected with. There have been many since then, of course, but that's the one that turned the corner for me.
So your books are just as much for skeptics as they are for really anyone interested in learning more. And I'm curious. I mean, I would think it's a wide-ranging audience, from professional people all the way to just lay community people wanting to learn more or to understand more.
Yeah, it's all types of people who have these.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually did something I called the Denny's experiment, and this was after I started writing The Light Beyond. And I was out late at night with some friends. We'd gone to a movie, and we stopped at Denny's, on the way home. And we started talking about the book, what I was working on, and there were 4 or 5 of us at the table, and most of them were skeptical. They said, "Well, this sounds, like I don't quite believe this." So courageously, I might add, I stood up in the Denny's, and there were like 20 people there. It was a good late night crowd, thank heavens. And I told them what I was doing, and I said, "How many of you have ever had an experience like this, or know of an experience like this?" And more than half of them did, and they weren't put out at all that I had done that. They started telling stories about their grandmother or their husbands or themselves having had these experiences. Many of them had no idea that they had a name. And once you put it, that what I found out in this business is once you put a name to something and a definition, then there's many people who say, "I've had that," or "I've heard about it." Before it's named and defined, they're kind of afraid of it in a way, because they're afraid of ridicule. And now, if I were to do the Denny's experiment, I'd get kicked out, of course. But I think most everybody in the room would have a story of an experience, their own or somebody else's close to them.
So I have a question. You talked about a gap with children or adolescents versus adults. Where I understand the gap, but what were the differences in these experiences?
Well, it's interesting because children have very vivid experiences. And I'm sorry. And we were actually able to have the children draw many of them and draw in crayons what happened to them. They're really cool. I'll try to get you some and send them to you. But children have very vivid experiences, and most adults have vivid experiences. But children have a much shorter life review because they have a shorter life to review. But they have the light that they see, the light we talk about at the end of the tunnel, has a lot of long-term power over a child, and it's very transformative with everybody, but it seems to me be more so with children. So after we did the book on children and near-death experiences, we went on to do a big study called the Transformation Study, and we looked at literally thousands of people who had had experiences like this, and we found that children who had the experience, the transformation caused by it lasted their entire lives. I mean, we were talking to people who were in their 60s and 70s and who had had a near-death experience as children, and they were transformed, and memorably so, for all these 6 or 7 decades, by their experience.
So I'm curious, when we talk about near-death experience, I've heard the term used for someone not necessarily in a surgical situation or in a death or recovery mode from their body, but also as an experience, they were going into this accident that they've recovered out of without injury, but saw a flash of moments in life. So even though their body may have not been physically injured in any way where it was dying, they deem that to be a near-death experience. Would you also term it to be that?
Oh, sure. It's there's a lot of experience. There's a lot of names for it. One is a fear-death experience. So someone who gets into an extremely fearful situation like that will often have many of the symptoms or traits of a near-death experience. So they're called there's an all-encompassing term for it, and I can't remember the name of it right now. But it's very transformative, and we've talked to those people as well, and those are transformative. Then there's other types of experiences that happen, like in the midst of yoga, for instance. There's Kundalini experiences, there's meditation experiences, there's experiences where they've looked at people in Switzerland and France, who had mountain accidents where they accidentally fell off a mountain and they were belayed, so they didn't have any damage take place. But the fall would bring on this whole experience that was just like a near-death experience. And they would have a life review. They would have the powerful light, being of light that would appear to them, and it happened in a flash, but it was there.
Is it a surge of energy that evokes this? How would you explain that?
I can't explain that. I think it's the approaching death is how I would generally explain it. And if you look at some of the most recent study, there's a study that came out last week by Sam Parnia, and he looked at 564 people who had had cardiac arrest and were considered dead, but he ended up with just 54, 57, which is quite a few people. And the criteria was that their hearts had stopped, their brain waves had pretty much disappeared. They were technically dead, yet their brains somehow revived. Sometimes after as long as an hour, their brain waves came back, and they reported have very deep near-death experiences. Just like the traits you hear, when you read a book about near-death experiences, that's what these are. They're extremely deep. And there's all this speculation about why that happened, because technically they're dead, yet somehow their brain has revived. I mean, there's one of the cases was person was dead and on a gurney for an hour. And I'm going to shut that off, sorry. And yet they revived. Yet they revived, and they had these very, very deep near-death experience.
Right. So they revived. They had no brain activity, but when they revived, they had memories of.
Yes, and during that, they had memories of that period where they had no brain activity.
Yeah,
those memories are just like near-death experiences. They are near-death experiences, actually. And they would go very deep. They would have very, very close connections with dead relatives, which is one of the things that happens in almost all near-death experiences. They would see a being of light. They would communicate with the being of light. Sometimes the being of light would send them to a place that was like a city, a crystal city.
So we've heard from researchers who have worked with patients in their end of life. And they talk about a common theme in a natural course of end of life where people are in and out of being lucid and not, and they all seem to have a similar pattern of talking to people that aren't there or sharing stories that don't make sense to maybe someone who is sitting with them and who's present. And would you suggest that those are near-death experiences or transitional to end of life? How might you interpret that?
Well, what we would do is call that something called terminal lucidity. And what terminal lucidity is, it's a flash of life that takes place shortly before one's death. And I think this is extremely common. It's just only recently been named and defined. But now that it's been named and defined and it's kind of out there, I think we'll get a lot more reports. What that involves, and I'm sorry, I can't shut that message off.
We're not hearing it. We're not
hearing it at all, so no
Good.
worries.
So when I go like that, that's only me. All right. So anyway, back to the terminal lucidity. It's defined as a flash of life that takes place shortly before one's death. So I witnessed one years ago, my son had a broken leg and I was visiting him in the hospital over the course of several days. Across the hallway, they moved a man in who was, he had dementia and he was on his last legs with dementia. They put him in the bed. He really wasn't moving. They figured he would last another couple of days. The next day, when I came in, he was standing on his bed and his family was there, 7 members. And he had a message for each of them. Some of it was just financial message, some was spiritual message. And it was very interesting to watch because he went kind of around the room talking to them, and they were elated because they thought he had healed and that they were going to be able to take him home. And then the next day I came in the morning, the bed was empty, and they said he had died that night. That's typical trait of a terminal lucidity. The person has a flash of lucidity, and then they die shortly thereafter. What's amazing about terminal lucidity is that many people who are brain dead will come out of their brain death and have lucid moments. And it's the same, it follows the same track. There are people there see it, they talk to the person, they know the person shouldn't be speaking because they haven't spoken for a week, and then they die. So there's a lot of different permutations in this field, a field of near-death studies. And that's one. The other one is what we just covered, the fear-death experience, and then the near-death experience. What our book deals with, Proof of Life After Life, which is just out this last week, is another permutation called a shared death experience. And a shared death experience is, it's simply stated, okay, it's a shared death experience is when a living person who is well experiences the death experience of a person who is dying. So in other words, if I'll give you a great example. In the book we have the book is divided into 7 basic chapters, 7 reasons to believe in the afterlife. One of them is sometimes, and these are actually stories from doctors and nurses, and that's what surprised me in this book is with the number of doctors we got to cooperate with this. But there's not often, but infrequently, doctors will see a mist rising from a dying person's, as they're dying, a dying person's body. That classifies as a shared death experience because we see that they're dying. We can see this mist rising. And we had one doctor in upstate New York who went into a patient. The nurse told him, it was late at night, and the nurse told him that the patient was having distress. So he went into her room, it was dark, and adjusted her oxygen level and sat there with her for a while. And all of a sudden he saw this greenish mist rise out of her body and hover in the air. And then he said it was like as if it was being sucked into a vacuum tube. The mist just sucked and went away. We've had several of those reported to us by doctors. Another example of that would be, and that's a shared death experience because they're sharing their death experience with us. And that makes it an objective experience. So a near-death experience is not objective, it's subjective. Only the person who has it can really describe it and say what went on. So it's open to skepticism. But a shared death experience is not. There's objectivity. People outside of the dying person's body actually see something take place that qualifies as a dying experience.
Would someone saying that they knew of someone dying, they just felt it, it was intuitive that someone was dying at a particular moment, would you consider that a shared death experience?
Yeah, that's one of our reasons for believing in the afterlife. It's called a precognitive experience. So an example of a precognitive experience would be that pretty much what you just described. If you wake up in the middle of the night and a member of your family, say someone close to you, is standing at the foot of the bed, and they say, "Fran, I'm gonna die tonight," but no one expected them to die. That would be even more of a gold standard. And then you get up in the morning and you find that they have died. That's a precognitive experience. Sometimes those even happen to someone who survives. I mean, we had one story in San Diego, a woman named Olga Gerhardt, who had a heart transplant. And she was from a Mexican family, so they're very close, as you know. And so the whole hospital waiting room was filled with her family, but her stepson or her son-in-law would not come to the hospital because he just couldn't deal with hospitals. So she had her heart transplant, and her heart stopped several times during the course of the night. He went home and he went to bed, and he woke up, and there's Olga standing at the foot of the bed. And he said, well, I thought you were having surgery. And she said, I am. They're having some problems, but tell everyone I'm okay. And so what's spectacular about this one is that he did call everyone and told them what had taken place. When she came out of it, he went into the hospital then. When she came out of it, she said, I left my body and I went home and I talked to you. And I told you that I was going to be all right. And so you have a multiply confirmed shared death experience there.
Well,
yeah.
Spectacular.
And then there's a number of other types of shared death experiences. There's ones where people actually pick up information that they use. They're life-changing. All near-death experiences are life-changing. But some people pick up information and skills that they use later in their life. There's a doctor named Tony Sikora, who's an orthopedic surgeon in, upstate New York. And he was struck in the back of the neck by a bolt of lightning at a picnic. He cardiac arrested, came back, and when he came back, he had heard music on the other side, and that's frequent. And he found himself getting a piano, working on that music to try to duplicate it, because he said it was the most beautiful music he'd ever heard. The upshot is that Tony Sikora has now appeared in several concert halls around the world as a musician, including Lincoln Center and including halls in Austria. And he spends his day doing surgery, and he spends the night making music.
Wow.
And that's a common trait of a near-death experience, is that people will pick up a new skill.
It's interesting. It's change, but it's also transformation, really, when you think of it in terms of that experience. Well, Paul, this has been a great conversation. We're actually almost out of time, but would love to have you share just how people can connect with you and connect with your work. A lot of our listeners want to connect with our guests, and how might they do that?
Well, I'll give you two ways. I'll pull this up. This is our new book, Proof of Life After Life. And it just came out, like I said, this last week. It's sold out the first printings. It's available at Amazon. And if there's any bookstores left, it's available there too. And I have a website, and it's called paulperryproductions.com. paulperryproductions.com. And that has ways to contact me as well.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Great. Paul, we want to thank you so much for being our guest here on Let's Talk Death, and for sharing all the research and inspiration behind your great work.
Well, thank you very much. And you're doing great work as well. People need information about healing.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to those joining us for this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
And if you know of a bereaved adult, refer them to our AMF app, where adults of all ages connect with others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletters for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
So again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.